The night Matilda Hayes walked into the Harvest Dance at Clearwater Creek, every man in Colton County straightened his spine and forgot his own name. It was the autumn of 1878, and the town of Clearwater Creek sat like a dusty jewel on the edge of the Oklahoma Territory, a place where the wind came down from the north in October carrying the smell of dry grass and wood smoke, where the stars pressed so close to the earth a person felt they might reach up and smear them like paint. The Harvest Dance was the biggest event of the year, held in the newly constructed livery barn that old Jonas Pratt had thrown open for the occasion, hung with paper lanterns and dried corn husks, the rough-hewn walls strung with ribbon that Mrs. Pratt had ordered all the way from Kansas City. A four-piece band set up in the corner with a fiddle, a banjo, a squeeze box, and a man who played the spoons with more enthusiasm than talent. And the whole thing smelled like pine resin and dried apples, and the beeswax candles that flickered in glass jars along every flat surface. Matilda Hayes arrived at 7:30. She was 22 years old, the daughter of the late Reverend Edmund Hayes and his wife Clara, who still ran the little boarding house on the south end of Main Street. Matilda had grown up in Clearwater Creek, had learned to read from her father's Bible, and to cook from her mother's silent example, had spent her teenage years listening to her father preach about grace, and her mother scrubbing floors with the kind of quiet fury that comes from a woman who has swallowed too many disappointments. When the Reverend passed 3 years back, taken by a fever that swept through the valley in the summer of 1875, Matilda had taken on half the work of the boarding house herself, hauling laundry and mending linens and serving breakfast to the railroad surveyors and cattle buyers who came through on their way to somewhere more important. She was not bitter about any of it, but she had grown watchful. She had grown precise in the way a woman grows precise when she understands that no one is going to rescue her from a bad decision, that she alone will have to live inside the life she chooses. And so she had turned down 3 proposals in the past 2 years, each one from a man who had mistaken her willingness to pour their coffee for an invitation to own her future. Tonight she wore her best dress, a deep green wool with ivory buttons at the cuffs and a collar that her mother had trimmed with a strip of cream-colored lace. Her dark hair was pinned up with 2 tortoiseshell combs that had belonged to her grandmother. She was not trying to impress anyone. She simply believed that if a thing was worth doing, it was worth doing with your whole self, and the Harvest Dance was worth doing right. Amos Archer saw her the moment she stepped through the barn doors. He was standing near the far wall, one boot crossed over the other, a tin cup of apple cider in his hand that he had not actually drunk from in the past 20 minutes. He was 26. Lean and broad-shouldered in the way of a man who has spent years doing work that actually meant something, his face tanned to the color of good saddle leather from long days on the trail. He had a straight nose, dark eyes that were the particular shade of brown that looks almost black in low light, and a jaw that was not handsome in any soft or easy way, but was the kind of jaw that made a person feel certain the man behind it would not fold under pressure. He wore a clean shirt, dark trousers, and his good boots, which he had polished that morning for the first time in a considerable while. His hat was brown with a slight crease in the crown, and he had not removed it yet, though he would when the dancing started, because his mother had raised him with certain non-negotiable principles. Amos worked for the Halcyon Ranch, which was the biggest cattle operation in the county, owned by a man named Preston Hale who was shrewd and fair in equal measure, and who paid his hands honestly and on time. Amos had been there 4 years. He was not a man who spoke a great deal, but when he did, people tended to listen, because he had the quality of only opening his mouth when he had something worth saying. He was liked among the other ranch hands, respected by the foreman, and largely invisible to the women of Clearwater Creek, because he did not perform any of the rituals that made a man visible. He did not drink loudly at the saloon or swagger down Main Street or make jokes at the general store that were designed to catch a woman's ear. He worked. He read, when he had the time. He wrote letters to his younger sister Eleanor, who lived in St. Louis with her husband and their 2 small children. He thought about the future in quiet, serious ways that he did not share with anyone. He had seen Matilda Hayes before, naturally, in the way that everyone in a small town sees everyone else. He had bought breakfast at the boarding house twice during the spring when he had come into town for ranch business and needed a meal. She had been efficient and polite, and had refilled his coffee without being asked, and he had left a larger coin than was customary because the food had been genuinely good, and because something in the way she moved through that small dining room had suggested a kind of competence and self-possession that he found more interesting than he could easily explain. He had not spoken to her beyond the ordinary exchanges of commerce. He had not given himself permission to do more than notice her, because he had learned enough about himself to know that once he started paying attention to something, he did not stop, and he was not prepared for that particular kind of attention yet. He was not sure he was prepared for it now. But there she was, stepping through the barn doors in the green dress, and the paper lanterns caught in her hair, and Amos Archer, who was not a man given to sentiment or impulse, felt something shift quietly in the center of his chest like a stone being moved aside to let water through. He stayed where he was. He watched. The first man to approach Matilda Hayes that evening was Cecil Drummond, who ran the feed store on the north end of town, and who was 28 and perfectly decent, with red hair and freckled hands, and a reputation for being good to his horses. He made his way toward her within the first 10 minutes of her arrival, while she was still standing near the entrance talking with her friend Pearl Calloway, and he asked her for the first dance with the kind of practiced confidence that suggested he had rehearsed the approach at least twice. Matilda smiled at him the way you smile at someone when you mean it entirely in the category of kindness and nothing else. "Thank you, Cecil," she said, and her voice was clear and warm, not unkind at all. "I believe I will sit the first few out." Cecil Drummond nodded and retreated with dignity, which Amos appreciated. He watched the whole thing from his place near the wall. Pearl Calloway, who was 23 and recently engaged to a young man named Thomas, leaned over and said something in Matilda's ear that made Matilda laugh and press her lips together as though she was trying not to laugh harder. Then the 2 of them drifted toward the refreshment table, and Cecil Drummond drifted toward the cider, and the band started up something lively that made the floorboards vibrate. The second man was Harlan Boggs, who worked at the telegraph office, and who was perhaps the most determined bachelor in Clearwater Creek, a thin man of 31 with a carefully combed mustache and opinions about things he had no personal experience with. He intercepted Matilda at the refreshment table with the air of a man who has calculated his odds and found them favorable. Amos watched him talk for longer than was comfortable, watched Matilda's expression remain pleasant and open and entirely unreachable, watched her shake her head gently when he extended his hand for a dance. Harlan Boggs's mustache twitched with something that was either disappointment or indignation, and he moved away. The third was a man Amos didn't recognize, someone visiting from the next county over, tall and handsome in a flashy sort of way with silver conchos on his belt that caught the lantern light. He was bold about it, cutting across the room toward Matilda with the directness of a man who was accustomed to getting what he aimed for. He was charming about it too, or tried to be. He said something that made several people nearby smile in appreciation of his nerve. Matilda thanked him with the same complete sincerity and refused him with the same complete certainty, and he walked away looking more confused than wounded, as though he genuinely could not understand the mechanism by which his charm had failed to operate. Pearl Calloway had gone to dance with her Thomas by now, and Matilda stood at the edge of the room with a cup of cider in one hand and watched the dancers with an expression that was hard to read from across the room. It was not loneliness, exactly. It was something more like patience. Like a woman who was waiting for something she was not entirely sure existed, but who was willing to wait anyway rather than settle for something that was merely available. Amos Archer had been watching all of this for the better part of an hour. He had drunk exactly half his cider. He had spoken briefly with his fellow ranch hand Daniel Croft, who had come to the dance with his wife Ruth and their baby daughter, who was currently asleep in a basket near the wall in the miraculous way that babies sometimes slept through fiddle music. He had nodded to the ranch foreman, a big quiet man named Ellis Wade, who had arrived with his hat in his hand, and a look on his face that suggested he had been persuaded to attend by forces beyond his control. He had watched the room with the same observational calm he brought to most things, but he had kept tracking back to Matilda Hayes. He had watched her turn down 4 men in total, because there had been a fourth between the visiting stranger and now, a young man of perhaps 19 who had been so nervous that his voice broke on the word dance, and who Matilda had declined with such gentle care that the boy had actually smiled on his way back to his friends, as though being turned down by her had been, in its own way, a gift. That was the thing about her, Amos thought. She was not cold. She was not playing a game or performing unavailability to make herself more desirable. Every refusal came from the same place, from something honest and self-knowing in her, and she gave each man the full and real version of herself in the moments when she said no, which meant she gave them something true even when it wasn't what they wanted. He set his cider cup down on a nearby barrel. He understood that he was likely to be refused too. He had no particular reason to believe he was different from Cecil Drummond or Harlan Boggs or the man with the silver conchos. He had no speech prepared, no practiced approach, no calculation of odds. He had only the observation of the past hour and the quiet certainty, which was the kind he trusted most, that he wanted to stand in front of her and see what happened when she looked at him directly. He crossed the room. He was not a man who hurried, and he did not hurry now, but he moved with the kind of purpose that parted a crowd without requiring anyone to move out of the way. He came to a stop a few feet from where she stood, and she turned as though she had sensed him coming, and for the space of a breath, they simply looked at each other. This close, he could see that her eyes were brown with small flecks of amber that caught the lantern light, and that she was studying him with the same careful attention she turned on everything else, reading him the way a person reads a page they expect to find important. He reached up and took his hat off, which was the thing his mother had raised him to do, and he held it at his side and he said, "Matilda Hayes, I know you've turned down every man who's asked you tonight, and I don't expect I'm owed a different answer than any of them. But I would very much like one dance if you're willing." He said it plainly without decoration, because decoration would have been dishonest, and dishonesty was not something he was capable of with her. He already knew that. Matilda Hayes looked at him for a moment that was long enough to feel like something real was happening in it. Then she said, "Yes." She said it the same way she had said no to everyone else, from somewhere honest and self-knowing, and that was how Amos understood that she meant it. He offered his hand and she took it, and they walked out onto the floor together, and the band was playing a waltz that the fiddle player was handling with more feeling than technical precision, and it did not matter because the feeling was the point. He was a competent dancer, which surprised her. Not elegant, not showy, but sure-footed and steady, his hand at her waist with exactly the right amount of pressure, the kind that said "I have you" and not "I own you." She found herself adjusting to him without having to think about it, which was itself a notable thing, because she was a woman who usually had to think quite consciously about sharing a space with another person. "You've been standing against that wall for an hour," she said, not accusingly, simply stating a fact. "I have," he said, "watching." Yes, she considered that. Most men who watch that long do it because they're calculating something, working out an angle. "I know," he said, "I was doing something else." "What were you doing?" He thought about how to answer that honestly. "Trying to understand something," he said. "I wasn't sure I had it understood enough to come over." "And do you have it understood enough?" "Not entirely," he said, "but I ran out of time." She laughed, and it was the real laugh, not the polite one she had been deploying all evening, and it startled both of them a little with its aliveness. "That is the most honest thing anyone has said to me in some time," she told him. "My name is Amos Archer," he said. "I work at the Halcyon Ranch. You've served me breakfast twice at the boarding house." "I remember," she said, and she did. She remembered him because he had been quiet in a way that was not unfriendly, and because he had read a book while he ate, which was unusual, and because he had left a larger coin than the meal warranted and had done it without making any particular show of doing so. "You were reading." "Thackeray," he said. "Vanity Fair, have you read it?" "My father had a copy," she said. "I read it twice." Something in his expression shifted, opened slightly, the way a window opens to let in air that the room has needed for some time. "What did you think of Becky Sharp?" he asked. "I thought she was the most fully realized person in the book," Matilda said, "and that Thackeray was simultaneously fascinated by her and frightened of her, which is a very particular kind of hypocrisy that men are prone to." Amos Archer was quiet for a moment, and then he said, with something that might have been the beginning of a smile, "That is exactly what I thought." The waltz ended and another began, and neither of them moved toward the edge of the room. They simply kept dancing, and the conversation kept going the way conversations go when two people discover that they think at a similar speed and in a similar register, when the pleasure of being understood runs alongside the pleasure of being surprised, when you ask a question expecting one kind of answer and receive a better one. He learned that she had been running most of the boarding house operation since her father passed, that her mother had spells of melancholy that came in waves, that she had taught herself to keep accounts, and had reorganized the house's finances in ways that had surprised even the bank man when he came to check on their loan status. She had done this quietly, without making it anyone else's business, because she was not the kind of person who needed credit for things, only results. She learned that he had come to Clearwater Creek from Missouri, where he had grown up on a small farm that his family had eventually lost to debt when he was 17, that he had spent 2 years working cattle drives up from Texas before settling into the steadier work at the Halcyon Ranch, that he was saving money towards something he hadn't fully articulated yet, but that involved land of his own, a piece of the territory that he could build something permanent on. "What would you build?" she asked during the third dance, which was a slower thing that the squeeze box carried mostly on its own. "A house first," he said, "then a barn, then whatever came after that. That's very practical." "It's what the order has to be," he said. "Do you have land in mind?" "There's a piece east of town," he said. 22 acres along the creek bend. The soil is good. There's timber for building and the water runs year-round." She knew the land he meant. She had walked along that creek bend as a girl, had picked wildflowers there in the springs of her childhood, had sat on the bank on summer evenings listening to the water and feeling the peculiar contentment of being exactly where you were. "That is good land," she said. "Yes," he said, "it is." They were very close now, the way that slow dancing makes you close, and she was aware of his height and the steadiness of him, and the fact that she had not once in the past 3 dances felt the need to perform anything. She had not smiled when she didn't mean it or said something warm when something true would serve better. She had simply been herself, which was the thing she almost never permitted herself to be in the company of someone she had only just met, because herself was not always the easiest version to manage. The band played on, and the evening deepened, and the paper lanterns burned lower in their glass jars. People danced and ate and talked and laughed. Children ran between adult legs until they were caught and put to sleep in wagons outside. Couples stood near the walls speaking quietly about things that no longer needed to be loud, because everything important could be said at close range. When the band finally stopped for a rest, Amos walked Matilda to the refreshment table and found her a fresh cup of cider and took one for himself, and they stood side by side in a comfortable quiet that felt like something they had already earned. "I should find Pearl," she said eventually, though she did not move toward doing so. "She went home 20 minutes ago," he said. Thomas looked like he was about to fall asleep standing up. Matilda laughed. "He always does at these things. He works very early hours." "What about you?" Amos said. "You work early hours too." "I do," she said. "I should probably go as well." "I'll walk you," he said, and it was not a question exactly, but it was not an assumption either. It was an offer made with the full understanding that she would accept or refuse it on her own terms. She looked at him for a moment. "All right," she said. They collected her shawl from the peg near the door and stepped out into the October night, which had gone cold in the way that only the territory could get cold, with a sharpness that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the vastness of the sky above it. The stars were extraordinary, thick as spilled flour across the black, and their breath made small clouds in the air as they walked. The boarding house was 4 blocks south, and the street was quiet, the rest of the town still mostly inside the dance or already home and dark behind closed windows. Their footsteps were the loudest thing, and neither of them hurried, because to hurry would have been to end something that neither of them wanted to end yet. "Can I ask you something?" Amos said as they turned the corner onto Maple Street. "You can ask," she said. "I can't promise what sort of answer you'll get." "Why did you say yes to me?" he said. "I'm not asking it the way most men would to congratulate myself. I'm asking because I watched tonight, and I think you had reasons for the others that were real and clear to you, and I'm curious what reason you had for me." Matilda walked a few steps in silence. The question deserved real thought, and he clearly knew that because he did not rush her with any follow-up. "You didn't try to convince me of anything," she said finally. "Every other man tonight came over with something to prove, even the decent ones. They had a version of themselves they were selling and they wanted me to buy it. You came over and just said what was true, that you didn't expect a different answer and you wanted one anyway. There was nothing for me to push against." She paused. "And you took your hat off," she added, with a small smile that he could hear in her voice even in the dark. "My father always said you could tell a great deal about a man by whether he remembered to take his hat off." Amos was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your father sounds like he was a thoughtful man." "He was," she said, and there was a small weight in the words that she did not try to hide. "I miss him a great deal." "I'm sorry," he said, and the words were simple, but they landed with the full weight of a person who meant them. They reached the boarding house. Light burned in the front window, which was her mother, who always waited up. The porch steps were 4 wide boards that creaked in a specific sequence that Matilda had memorized across years of navigating them in the dark. She turned at the foot of the steps and looked up at him in the starlight. "Thank you for the dances," she said. "Thank you for the yes," he said. She smiled, and it was the real smile, the one that went all the way in. "Good night, Amos Archer. Good night, Matilda Hayes." He waited until she was inside and the door had closed before he turned and walked back up the street, and the whole way back to the livery where his horse was stabled. He was aware of the night around him in a way he was not usually aware of it. The cold and the stars, and the particular quality of silence that follows something that has changed things. He rode back to the Halcyon Ranch with his thoughts arranged in a new configuration that would take him some time to fully understand, but which felt, in its core, like something good. In the weeks that followed the Harvest Dance, Clearwater Creek went about its autumn business with the industrious focus of a small town preparing for winter. The last of the cattle drives came through, kicking up dust clouds that turned the south sky amber in the afternoons. The farmers brought in the last of their corn and squash and laid up their root cellars with the grim determination of people who had lived through hard winters and intended to survive the next one. Mrs. Clara Hayes took in 2 new boarders, a pair of surveyors from Denver who were polite and paid on time and ate everything on their plates, and Matilda thanked God for them because the boarding house had been running lean since August. Amos rode into town on a Thursday morning, 10 days after the dance, ostensibly to pick up supplies for the ranch. He did pick up the supplies. He also, while passing the boarding house on his return, found himself stopping at the hitching post without quite having made the decision to do so. and knocking on the front door of the boarding house with his hat already in his hand. Clara Hayes answered the door, a small woman with Matilda's same dark eyes and the particular expression of a woman who has been managing other people's expectations for so long that she has made it into a kind of art form. "Mr. Archer," she said, which told him that Matilda had mentioned him. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, "I was hoping to speak with Matilda if she's available and willing." Clara Hayes looked at him for the length of time it took her to decide something. Then she stepped back and said, "Come in, I'll get her." He stood in the front parlor, which was clean and spare and smelled like wood smoke and lemon oil, and looked at the framed sampler on the wall that read "Trust in the Lord," and the small portrait of a serious-faced man in a minister's collar, who he took to be the late Reverend Hayes, and felt the particular self-consciousness of a man standing in a place where he is being evaluated by the walls themselves. Matilda appeared from the kitchen doorway, still wearing her apron, wiping her hands on a cloth. She looked surprised but not displeased, which he took as a good sign. "Amos," she said, "this is unexpected." "I know," he said, "I was in town. I thought if you had a few minutes you might walk with me." He paused. "I brought something." He held out the book he had tucked under his arm, a thin volume with a green cloth cover. "It's George Eliot's Middlemarch. I thought you might like it." She looked at the book and then at him, and her expression did a thing he would spend a long time afterward trying to describe to himself, became both softer and more alert at once, like a woman who has been standing guard against something and has just received a reason to stand down. "Come back at 2, she said. "The lunch dishes will be done." He came back at 2. They walked along the edge of town, and then down toward the creek, and the conversation picked up where it had left off 10 nights ago at the Harvest Dance, as though no time had passed, as though they had simply paused mid-sentence and were now resuming. They talked about Middlemarch, which she had already read, and about her father's library, and about what it felt like to grow up knowing the same few hundred books intimately rather than having access to thousands. He told her about a lending library he had visited in Missouri, once, that had left him with the feeling of standing at the edge of something vast that he would never have time enough to fully explore. She laughed and said she knew exactly that feeling, and that it was one of the best feelings she had, because it meant the world was larger than you could contain, which seemed to her like important information. They sat on the bank of the creek at the edge of the halcyon land on the piece of ground that Amos had been thinking about for nearly a year, and she looked out at the water bending between its banks and the cottonwoods that lined it, going gold and orange now in the October light, and she said, "I see why you want it." "Do you?" he said. "It's patient land," she said. "It doesn't hurry." He looked at her rather than the land. "No," he said, "it doesn't." After that Thursday, it became a regular thing. He came to town most weeks, on whatever day the ranch business brought him in, and he always stopped, and she was always either available or she would name a time when she would be, and they walked or sat in the parlor while her mother worked in the kitchen with pointed tact, and they talked. They talked about everything. About books and about God, and about the question of whether the territory would become a state in their lifetimes, and what that would mean for the land claims, and the people who had been here first. That last topic led them into a longer conversation than either had anticipated, because Amos had spent time enough on the cattle trails to have seen things that troubled him, and Matilda had grown up hearing her father preach about justice in ways that had sunk into her deeper than she often admitted. Her father had been unusual among the preachers of his generation, in that he had spoken openly, from his pulpit, about the removal of the 5 civilized tribes and the ongoing violations of treaty rights that the federal government continued to enact, and it had made him unpopular with several of the more prosperous members of his congregation who held land that had been legally questionable in its acquisition. Reverend Hayes had preached anyway. He was that kind of man. Matilda told Amos this story one afternoon in November, sitting in the parlor with the stove going warm between them, and when she finished, Amos was quiet for a moment and then said, He sounds like a man who understood what his faith was actually asking of him. Yes, she said. He did. She looked at him. Do you? I'm still figuring that out, he said honestly. But I think I understand more than I did. She believed him, which was important, because she had a very good ear for the difference between a man who said the right things to impress her and a man who said the true things even when they were incomplete. November deepened into December, and the creek froze in the shallows, and the boarding house was full and warm, and Matilda's hands were always occupied with something: laundry or mending or cooking or accounts. Amos came in from the ranch less frequently in the cold months, the roads being difficult and the work still demanding regardless of the weather, but he wrote letters, which she had not expected. The first one arrived on a Tuesday morning in the third week of November, delivered by the postmaster's boy, and her mother brought it to her at the breakfast table with an expression that was carefully neutral, which meant that she had opinions about it. The letter was 3 pages long, written in a hand that was clear and deliberate, and had the quality of a person who wrote slowly and meant every word. He told her about the ranch in winter, about the way the halcyon land looked under the first snowfall, about a conversation he had had with the old Cheyenne man named Two Roads who came through the ranch territory in his seasonal movements, and whom Amos had spoken with enough to have gained a halting kind of mutual respect. He asked about the book. He asked about her mother. He said he thought about the creek bend often and hoped she did not find that strange. She wrote back the same afternoon, 4 pages, and she did not find it strange at all. The letters went back and forth through December and into January, and they were the kind of letters that people do not usually write because most people edit themselves too heavily when they pick up a pen, afraid of being understood too precisely. These two did not edit themselves. Matilda wrote about her mother's melancholy spells, and about the weight of managing a household, and about the loneliness that came sometimes at night when the boarding house was dark, and she lay awake listening to the wind in the eaves and wondering if this was all her life was going to be, and then hating herself for wondering that because it sounded like ingratitude and she was not ungrateful. She wrote about her father's death and how she still, 2 years later, sometimes turned around in the kitchen expecting to see him at the doorway with his book under his arm and his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. She wrote about what she wanted, not vaguely, but specifically, and that specificity surprised her even as she wrote it, because she had not known how clearly she knew what she wanted until she began writing it down for him. Amos wrote about the farm his family had lost and what it had done to his father, who was a proud man and had not recovered well from the loss of the land, who had taken to silence afterward in a way that had hollowed out the household before Amos was old enough to understand what hollowness meant. He wrote about the cattle drives and the specific kind of loneliness that comes from sleeping under open sky for months at a time with the same 20 men, the paradox of proximity without intimacy. He wrote about the land he wanted and what he imagined building there, and these descriptions were more detailed now, more populated, as though someone had moved into the imaginary house that he had previously been picturing as empty. In February, Preston Hale, the owner of the Halcyon Ranch, called Amos into his office at the main house and offered him a foreman position, because Ellis Wade was retiring in the spring to tend his wife who had developed a condition in her joints that made the harsh winters difficult for her. The pay would be significantly better. The responsibility would be significantly more. Amos asked for a night to think about it, and Preston Hale, who was a perceptive man, said, "Take what you need." Amos rode out to the creek bend that evening in the February dusk, where the ice was still thick along the edges, and the cottonwoods were bare and gray against a sky that had gone the color of old pewter. He stood on the bank and looked at the land and thought about what he was building toward and what he needed to build it, and whether the timing of any of this was under his control or whether it had already been set in motion by forces that he had simply been slow to recognize. He said yes to Preston Hale the next morning. He wrote to Matilda that same afternoon and told her about it, and she wrote back with a warmth that was unguarded in a way her letters had not quite been before, and he read that warmth and understood it for what it was. Spring came to Clearwater Creek with the abruptness of the territory, winter one week and green the next, the creek running high and fast with snowmelt, the meadows going bright with the small particular flowers that only bloomed for 2 weeks before the heat came. Amos rode into town on a Saturday in late March, which was a day he did not usually come in, and he arrived at the boarding house at 11 in the morning with his hat in his hand, and a formality in his posture that Clara Hayes, who answered the door again, recognized immediately. "I'll get her," Clara said, and there was something in her voice that had not been there in the autumn, something that might have been careful hope. Matilda came from the back of the house in her everyday dress, her hair not pinned as elaborately as it was for going out, and she looked at him standing in the parlor and read everything in how he was standing. "All right," she said before he had spoken. He looked at her. "I haven't said anything yet." "I know," she said, "but I know what you're going to say, and I want you to know before you say it that my answer is yes." "You don't know exactly what I'm going to say," he said, and there was something around the corners of his mouth that was trying to be a smile. "You are going to say something about the Creek Bend land," she said, "and something about what you have saved, and something about what you intend to build, and then you are going to ask me something." He stood there looking at her for a moment. "You're right," he said, "about all of it." He told her about the foreman pay and what he had been able to put aside over the winter, about the meeting he had already scheduled with the land agent for the following week about the Creek Bend property. He told her what he intended to build, and in what order, and what he believed they could make of it together. He was practical and clear and entirely without performance, because this was not a performance. This was a man laying out what was real so that a woman he respected could make a real decision. And then he said, "I would like to marry you, Matilda, if you'll have me." Matilda Hayes, who had stood unmoved by every approach and charm and calculated advance that the men of Clearwater Creek had aimed at her in the past 3 years, felt something in her chest do exactly what she had read about in novels and had privately suspected was a thing that only happened in novels, a kind of giving way, not a collapse but a yielding, like a door that has been held shut very carefully finally being opened from the inside rather than pushed from the outside. "Yes," she said. For the second time, in the same clear, grounded way she had said it the first time at the Harvest Dance when he had come to her last and honest and had asked for nothing more than one dance. "Yes." Clara Hayes, from the kitchen doorway where she had been standing with her hands clasped in front of her, and her heart doing something complicated, let out a breath that she had apparently been holding for several months. They were married in June of 1879, on the 21st, which was the longest day of the year, which Matilda had chosen because she wanted to start with as much light as possible. The ceremony was held in the little white church on Elm Street where her father had preached for 17 years, performed by the current minister, a young man named Pastor Green who had known the Reverend Hayes, and who conducted the service with a simple sincerity that Matilda appreciated. Pearl Calloway stood beside her, which was right and proper, and Daniel Croft stood beside Amos, which was also right and proper, and the pews were full of people from the town who had watched this unfold over the winter with the particular satisfaction of people who enjoy seeing the world arrange itself sensibly. Matilda wore a dress that she and her mother had made together over the course of 3 weeks, cream-colored cotton with small embroidered flowers at the collar and cuffs, and she carried wildflowers picked that morning from the meadow along the creek, the same meadow she had run through as a girl. She looked like something that had always been on its way to this moment and had simply taken the time to arrive correctly. Amos stood at the front of the church in his best suit, which he had bought for the occasion, and which fit him well because Pearl Calloway's Thomas, who kept a general goods store, had insisted on having it fitted properly. He watched her come down the aisle, and his face did something that the people in the pews who were watching him found more moving than the flowers or the music. Something open and complete, like a man who has arrived somewhere he intended to go and is genuinely, specifically glad to be there. The words they spoke were the old words, the ones that have been said in churches since long before either of them was born, and they said them with full attention, meaning each syllable. I will. I do. I take this woman. I take this man, till death do us part. The lunch reception was held at the boarding house, which Clara Hayes had transformed with tables borrowed from 4 different neighbors and food that represented 3 weeks of planning and execution. There was roast chicken and cornbread and green beans stewed with salt pork, and a honey cake that Clara had stayed up until midnight the previous evening to finish. People ate and talked and laughed, and the June sunlight came through the windows and lay in long, warm rectangles on the floor. Amos's sister Eleanor had come from St. Louis by train with her husband Frank and their 2 children, a boy of 6 named Henry and a girl of 4 named Bate. And Eleanor, who had her brother's dark eyes and a warmth that was entirely her own, embraced Matilda upon introduction with the confidence of someone who has already decided to love a person before meeting them. His letters about you, Eleanor said, close to Matilda's ear, were the most words he has ever written me in his life. I knew you must be remarkable. His letters to me were remarkable too, Matilda said, which made Eleanor laugh and hug her again. The land purchase had been completed in May. The Creek Bend property was theirs, 22 acres with good soil and year-round water and the cottonwoods along the bank, and Amos had already begun clearing the site for the house with help from Daniel Croft and 2 other ranch hands who had volunteered their Sundays. The foundation was laid by the time they married, the stonework solid and true, and the framing had begun, and the smell of fresh-cut lumber over the creek meadow was the smell of something being built from intention. They spent their first married summer between the boarding house, where Matilda continued to help her mother until the new house was ready, and the halcyon ranch, where Amos's work as foreman kept him long days that he came home from tired in a way that was still good. The way tiredness is when it comes from work that is yours. He rode the 5 miles between the ranch and town and back more times than he could count that summer, because being separated from her, even by a working day, had become something he noticed in a way he had not anticipated. He had spent his adult life comfortable with solitude. He still was, in general. But there was a specific quality to the evenings when he came in from the ranch and found her in the kitchen or the parlor, that quality of return, of the world clicking into its correct configuration, that he had not known he was missing until he had it. The house was finished in September. It was not large, but it was well built, 2 rooms downstairs and a loft bedroom above, with a proper stone fireplace and a covered porch that looked east toward the creek where it bent through the cottonwoods, and windows that Amos had framed wide because Matilda had said once, in a letter the previous winter, that what she would want most in a house was light. Every window faced a direction that caught something. The kitchen window caught the morning sun. The parlor window caught the afternoon. The bedroom window caught the stars. The day they moved in, they carried their things across the threshold with Clara Hayes and Pearl and her Thomas and Daniel and Ruth and little Mary Croft, who was 14 months old now and walking with the determined but unreliable confidence of toddlers everywhere. It took most of the morning and involved a great deal of good-natured arguing about the best placement of furniture and a lunch of bread and cheese and apple cider eaten on the front porch in the September sun. And at the end of it, when everyone had gone home, Matilda stood in the parlor of the house that Amos had built for them and looked around at the walls and the floor and the windows full of late afternoon light, and felt something settle in her so completely and finally that she sat down in the nearest chair and put her face in her hands and cried. Not from sadness. From the particular relief of arriving somewhere after a long journey, the kind of arrival you feared might not happen, that you had believed in sometimes and doubted in others, and that had come anyway in the end, because some things are both fragile and inevitable at once. Amos found her like that and sat down beside her and put his arm around her and did not tell her not to cry or ask her what was wrong, because he already knew, and because there was nothing wrong. There was only this. "We built it," she said, after a while, her voice muffled somewhat. "We did," he said. She lifted her face and looked at him, and he looked back, and they were quiet for a moment in the light. "I love you," she said, and it was the first time she had said those specific words in that specific order to him, and she said them the same way she said everything, plainly and precisely, and with the full weight of what she meant behind them. "I love you," he said back, in the same register, and it was not an echo but an equal. The first winter in the new house was a real winter, an Oklahoma Territory winter of the kind that arrives with its full intention and does not apologize. The creek froze solid, and the snow came in waves, and the wind found every gap in every wall, and they spent a good portion of November and December plugging those gaps with whatever was available and arguing companionably about the most efficient method of keeping the kitchen warm. They had a wood stove and enough timber cut to see them through, and they had the fireplace, and they had each other, which turned out to be a more efficient heat source than either of them had specifically planned for. Clara Hayes was at the boarding house in town, which Matilda worried about, and so she went in twice a week through the worst of the weather, bundled in the coat that Amos had bought her from the dry goods store in November, a heavy wool thing with a fur collar that she had initially protested as excessive and had subsequently appreciated immensely. She brought her mother food from the Creek Bend farm, dried beans and cured pork and the apples they had put up in the fall, and she sat with her mother in the boarding house kitchen and drank tea and talked, and Clara Hayes, who had been a solitary woman in her grief for 3 years, began, slowly and with the particular caution of someone who has learned not to trust ease, to become something else, something lighter. Part of this was Amos. He came with Matilda on Sundays, and he fixed things in the boarding house that had needed fixing for some time, without being asked, in the matter-of-fact way of a man who sees a thing that needs doing and does it. He replaced a window frame that had been drafty since the previous winter. He shored up the back porch railing. He sat across the table from Clara Hayes and had conversations with her that were not about weather or practicalities, but about real things, her life and her husband and what she made of the world she had been given. And Clara Hayes, who had long since stopped expecting to be spoken to as though she were a full and interesting person, found herself talking in ways she had not talked since the Reverend died. "He's a good man," she told Matilda one February afternoon, in the tone of a woman delivering a verdict she has deliberated carefully. "Yes," Matilda said, "he is. Your father would have liked him." Matilda thought of the letter she had written to Amos in December and his letter back, and the conversation they had had at length about her father and faith and what it meant to live in a way that honored what you believed. "I know," she said. "I think so too." Spring came again, and with it the second year of their life at the Creek Bend. Amos had made arrangements with Preston Hale for a portion of his foreman wages to be taken against the purchase of a small cattle herd of his own, which Hale had agreed to with the generosity of a man who believed in rewarding people who worked well and thought long. By May, Amos had 20 head of his own cattle running with the halcyon herd, a small beginning that would grow. He had also put in a kitchen garden at the house, because Matilda had a knowledge of what to grow and how to grow it that had been practical knowledge her entire life, and now it was practical knowledge applied to their own ground, their own earth, and there was a particular satisfaction in that which she felt every time she knelt in the soil and put her hands in it. It was in April of that second spring, on a morning that smelled like mud and new grass, that Matilda realized she was with child. She sat with the knowledge for 2 days before she told Amos, not because she was afraid of his response, but because she wanted the private space of understanding it herself first, of turning it over in the quiet of her own mind and feeling all the dimensions of it. The gladness, which was large. The fear, which was honest. The sense of the world expanding again into a new configuration that she would need to learn the shape of. She told him on the third evening, after supper, sitting on the front porch in the April dusk with the creek audible somewhere below them in the cottonwoods. He went very still for a moment, the way he went still when something reached him deeply, and she watched his face move through several things in quick succession, and then arrive at something that she did not have a precise word for, but that was compounded of joy and solemnity and fierce tenderness in proportions that made her eyes fill. He reached across and took her hand, both of his around hers, and he said, "Are you well? How are you feeling?" "Tired," she said honestly. "And glad." "Good," he said. "Both of those are good." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm going to take very good care of you." "I know you are," she said, "but I am also going to take very good care of myself." "I would like us to be clear on that." The corners of his mouth moved. "Crystal clear," he said. The summer passed with its particular texture of heat and work, and the growing weight of the child that moved and shifted and made itself known in ways that were sometimes uncomfortable and always astonishing. Matilda continued running the household and helping her mother and keeping accounts, and doing all the things she had always done, adjusting for what she could no longer do comfortably and not apologizing for what she still could. The women of Clearwater Creek, who had opinions about what a woman in her condition should and should not be doing, expressed those opinions with the best of intentions, and Matilda listened to all of them with the same patient smile she had used to decline every man at the Harvest Dance, which accomplished the same purpose of honoring the feeling without committing to the substance. The baby arrived in November, on a cold and blustery evening when the wind was high, and the first serious snowfall of the season was threatening from the north. Clara Hayes had come out to the creek bend a week before to be there, and Pearl Calloway was there too, because Pearl had delivered her own first child in August and felt herself adequately experienced, and the midwife Mrs. Greer came from town in her buggy in the late afternoon. Amos was in the house, and then not in the house when the women decided he would be more useful elsewhere, and he spent 2 hours sitting on the cold porch with his elbows on his knees and his hands clasped and talking to God in the direct and unsentimental way he had developed for conversations with God, the same way he talked to everyone he respected. The baby was a boy. He was announced into the world with a voice that seemed outsized for his size, which was robust, and which Amos heard from the porch and which brought him immediately to his feet and inside the house. They named him Edmund for Matilda's father, and his second name was James, for Amos's grandfather. Edmund James Archer arrived in the territory in November of 1880, and he was healthy and loud and looked remarkably. In the way that Amos reported to his sister Eleanor in the letter, he wrote that same night by lantern light, while the household slept around him, like a red and extremely indignant potato, which Eleanor would later tell him was the most honest description of a newborn she had ever received from a first-time father. Edmund grew at the rate that babies grow when they are well-fed and well-loved, which is faster than seems possible, and the house on the creek bend grew with him in the particular way that a house grows around a child, filling with small things and loud things and things that had to be put out of reach. Clara Hayes came out from town most Sundays and sat in the parlor with Edmund on her knee, with an expression of such complete contentment that Matilda sometimes had to leave the room briefly, because the sight of it moved her more than she could easily account for. The cattle operation grew too, slowly and steadily, the way things grow when they are tended with patience rather than impatience. Amos added head each year with the careful incrementalism of a man who has learned from his father's example that overreach is the specific enemy of everything you have built. He remained as foreman at the Halcyon Ranch through these years, and Preston Hale, who was now in his 60s and beginning to think about what came after, had conversations with Amos that suggested a future arrangement that neither of them had yet put into specific words. The territory was changing around them, which was the permanent condition of the territory in those years, always becoming something else. The railroad pushing further and the towns growing and the land being claimed and sold and argued over. In 1889, the federal government would open the unassigned lands to settlement in the land run, and Clearwater Creek would double in size within a year as new people came through, and some of them stayed. But that was still ahead of them. In the early 1880s, the world of the Creek Bend was still largely the world they had made together, which was enough. Matilda began teaching. It started informally, in the spring of 1882, when she noticed that 3 of the children in the vicinity of the Creek Bend were getting no schooling at all, because the town school was too far for them to walk in bad weather, and their families could not consistently manage the transportation. She started holding sessions twice a week at the house, just reading and numbers at first, using her father's books and the school primer that Pearl Calloway's Thomas stocked at the store. Within a year there were 7 children coming to her kitchen table, and within 2 years there were 12, and the kitchen table had become a proper schoolroom that Amos had built on the east side of the house with large windows, because light mattered in learning as much as it mattered in living. She was a very good teacher. This did not surprise Amos, who had understood something about her capacity for this kind of careful, patient, intelligent attention long before it became formally evident. It satisfied something in her that she had not been entirely aware was unsatisfied, some desire to be useful in a way that was specifically hers, that used the things she was good at in service of something that mattered beyond the immediate and the domestic. She loved the work at the Creek Bend. She loved the house and the garden and the cattle they were building and the life they were making. And she also loved standing in front of 12 children with a piece of chalk and a slate board, and understanding that what happened in that room was changing what those children would be able to do in the world. Amos never once suggested in any way that this was too much, that she should choose one thing or the other, that the school on the side of the house was an addition she had not asked permission for. He had helped build the room. He brought extra wood for the small stove that heated it on cold mornings. He occasionally delivered children to the house when he was riding out toward the eastern farms and passed their places on the way. He did these things because they were the right things to do, and because the woman he had married was a woman whose full self he had signed on for, not a reduced version that would be more convenient to accommodate. In the spring of 1883, Matilda was with child again. The pregnancy was harder this time, more fatiguing, and she was 26 now rather than 22, which she said had nothing to do with it, and the midwife Mrs. Greer said it had everything to do with it, and they agreed to disagree, and both turned out to be partially right. The school sessions continued through the summer with some modification. Edmund, who was 2.5 now and extremely opinionated about things he did not fully understand, treated the school children as an extension of his personal territory, and attempted to participate in their lessons with the certainty of someone who has not yet been introduced to the concept of prerequisites. The second baby arrived in October of 1883 and was a girl, which Amos announced to the waiting room with a quiet joy that was just as genuine as the joy of Edmund's arrival, and showed itself in a different way, something gentler in the set of his shoulders, as though the specific weight of a daughter had settled him. They named her Clara Rose, for her grandmother, and for the roses that grew along the eastern fence of the Creek Bend property, which Matilda had planted in the spring of their first year there from a cutting that her father had tended in the boarding house garden. Clara Hayes, when she learned the baby's name, wept in a way she almost never wept, without trying to contain it, and held little Clara Rose for a long time while the household moved around her. The children were very different from each other. Edmund was loud and fast and curious in the way of a boy who moves through the world mostly at a run, always trying to get to the next thing before he had fully examined the current thing. Clara Rose was slower and more deliberate, her father's child in that quality, with her mother's dark eyes and a watchfulness that was already apparent in her infancy. By the time Edmund was 5 and Clara Rose 2, the difference between them was sufficiently pronounced that the two of them had worked out a natural division of territory, Edmund handling all matters of noise and motion, and Clara Rose handling all matters of observation and judgment, which was a surprisingly functional arrangement. Matilda's school grew, and eventually the county began talking about formalizing it, about building an actual schoolhouse and hiring proper teachers, which Matilda supported entirely and without ego, because the point had never been to have a school that was hers but to have children who could read. The county school opened in 1885, on land donated by Preston Hale, who had by then formalized his arrangement with Amos and was making plans to retire to a smaller house in town, leaving the halcyon ranch operation increasingly in the hands of the man who had been running it for years. Matilda was offered the first teaching position at the new school and accepted it with the same direct honesty with which she did everything, naming what she would need in terms of materials and what she thought the curriculum should include, and what she believed about the education of both boys and girls, the last of which provoked some discussion among the school board men, several of whom looked as though they wished they had not opened that particular door. She taught at the county school for the next decade, and she was what she had always been, precise and patient and genuinely interested in the minds in front of her. And a great number of children in Colton County learned to read and think and calculate because of the specific quality of care she brought to the work. In the fall of 1885, Preston Hale completed the transfer of the Halcyon Ranch operation to Amos, who became its owner in partnership with a deed arrangement that was structured over 10 years, and that represented the culmination of everything Amos had been working toward since before he came to Clearwater Creek. He signed the papers in Preston Hale's office in town on a Thursday afternoon in October, the same month and near the same week, though neither of them mentioned it, as the anniversary of the Harvest Dance where they had met 7 years before. He came home to the creek bend that evening with the signed papers in his breast pocket, and found Matilda in the kitchen with the children, Edmund helping set the table with the concentrated effort of a 7-year-old who has been given an important job, and Clara Rose sitting on the kitchen counter, despite the firm policy against sitting on the kitchen counter, watching her mother stir something at the stove with the focused attention of a child cataloging everything. Amos stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, looking at all of it, the warmth and the light and the smell of the supper and his children and his wife, and he felt the signed papers against his chest and thought about the piece of land along the creek bend where he had stood alone in the February dusk 6 years ago and tried to understand what he was working toward. He understood it now. It was this. It had always been this. Matilda looked up from the stove and saw his face and understood immediately what had happened. "It's done," she said. "It's done," he said. Edmund looked up from the silverware. "What's done?" "Something important," Amos told his son, and crossed the kitchen and kissed his wife on the temple and stood beside her at the stove, and she leaned briefly against him, the weight of her against his shoulder for just a moment before she went back to stirring, which was the same as everything between them had always been, grounded in the ordinary and made extraordinary by the intention behind it. The years that followed were full ones. The territory opened its unassigned lands in the Great Land Run of April 1889, and Clearwater Creek changed around them as new people poured in from everywhere, families from the east and the south and the north, bringing their different ways and their different histories and their hope, which was universal and recognizable in anyone. The town grew, 2 new streets and a second general store, and a small hotel that was not really a hotel so much as a large boarding house, which Clara Hayes noted with dry humor was something she had been running for 20 years without anyone calling it a hotel, and which Matilda laughed about with her mother over tea on the boarding house porch. Clara Hayes was healthy through these years, which was a mercy that Matilda did not take for granted. She had moved in 1887 out to the creek bend at Amos's invitation, and with what turned out to be less reluctance than Matilda had anticipated, taking the small room that Amos had added to the east side of the house the previous summer. She became, in that room in those years, a woman who had been given back to herself, who had found again the person she had been before grief had narrowed her, who told stories at the supper table that made the children shout with laughter, and who kept a kitchen garden of her own alongside Matilda's, and who read her late husband's books in the evenings by the parlor fire, and talked about them with her son-in-law, who was genuinely interested and never pretended to be. Edmund grew into a boy, and then a young man with his mother's precision and his father's steadiness, and a talent for numbers that his mother recognized, and did everything in her capacity to develop. He worked at the ranch through his adolescence, which was the right education for a boy growing up on the land, and he also worked at the school desk his mother put in front of him with the regularity of a natural season, which was a different but equally necessary education. He was 16 in the summer of 1897, and showing every indication of becoming exactly the person he was already in outline. Clara Rose was 14, and she was her grandmother's favorite, which everyone knew and no one pretended otherwise, because Clara Hayes made no attempt to conceal it, and Clara Rose received the preference with the amused self-possession of a girl who has been watching the people around her closely since, before she could reach the kitchen counter by herself. She had her father's dark eyes and her mother's way with words, and an independent streak that had manifested at age 4 and shown no signs of moderating. She wanted to be a doctor, which she stated at age 12 with the same matter-of-fact certainty with which Matilda had stated what she wanted in her letters to Amos in the winter of 1878, and the response in Clearwater Creek was similar, a mix of open encouragement and quiet skepticism, and Clara Rose responded to it the same way Matilda had responded to the opinions of the women about her pregnancy, with patient attention to none of it. Amos told her when she was 12 and had made this announcement that he thought she should do exactly that. She looked at him with the look she had, the one that cataloged and assessed. "Most people say it's not practical," she said. "Most people," her father said, "are thinking about the present rather than the future." She considered this. "Do you think I can?" "I think," Amos said, choosing his words with the care he always used when it mattered, "that you are the most capable person I know after your mother, and your mother is a category unto herself." He paused. "So yes, I think you can." Clara Rose Archer, at the age of 23, went to the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. She went in 1906, after years of preparation, and a network of support that included her mother's teaching connections and her father's patient cultivation of financial resources that had been earmarked for both children's education since before they were old enough to understand what education meant. She left on the train from Clearwater Creek in the early September of 1906, and both of her parents stood on the platform, and Amos kept his face very steady, and Matilda did not keep her face steady at all, which she later said was the prerogative of mothers. And Clara Rose looked out the train window as the platform fell behind and felt the territory receding and the future opening, and knew that both things were entirely right. But that was ahead of them. In the present tense of the mid-1880s and the 1890s, the world of the Creek Bend was a full world, a world with roots deep enough to hold in the storms and branches wide enough to provide shade. Amos ran the Halcyon Ranch with the same qualities he had brought to everything, patience and attention, and the specific intelligence of a man who has been paying attention to the world for long enough to understand its patterns. Matilda taught at the county school and came home to the Creek Bend, and talked with her husband in the evenings in the way they had always talked, with full attention and honest language, and the pleasure of two minds that had been in conversation for so long that the conversation had become part of the structure of each of them, as fundamental as anything. They disagreed about things, because they were both people with formed opinions and the courage to hold them. And when they disagreed, they were direct about it, which meant the disagreements were usually shorter and less damaging than the kind that circulate underground for years, because people are afraid to bring them to the surface. They had arguments that were real arguments, with raised voices sometimes, and the sharp frustration that comes from caring what the other person thinks and having them think something different. And then they had the resolution of those arguments, which always came back to the same thing, the bedrock understanding that whatever they disagreed about in the moment, they were on the same side in the large and permanent sense. And that was not something either of them was willing to damage over the small and temporary sense. It was not a perfect life in the sense of a life without difficulty. Winters were hard. The financial pressures of building and maintaining a cattle operation in the territory were real and constant. There was a drought in the summer of 1886 that cost them a third of their herd and sent them through the winter on careful planning and little margin. There was illness, the way there is always illness, a bad fever that Edmund had at age 9 that kept them both awake for 3 nights until it broke. And then they sat in the early morning on the porch in the particular drained calm of people who have been very frightened and have come through to the other side. And Amos held Matilda's hand, and neither of them said anything for a very long time, because there was nothing that words could add to what they both already knew, which was that they were lucky and grateful, and that some costs were not bearable to contemplate. There were also the ordinary griefs of time and change. Clara Hayes died in the spring of 1895 in the small room on the east side of the Creek Bend house, on a morning that was unexpectedly warm for March, with the creek running high outside the window and the first green showing in the cottonwoods. She died easily, which was the mercy of it, her breathing simply becoming quieter and then quieter still, and Matilda was with her, holding her hand, and the last thing Clara said was her daughter's name, and then she was quiet. The grief of that was real and large, and Matilda carried it in the particular way she carried everything, fully and without pretense, crying when she needed to cry and being functional when she needed to be functional, and not confusing those two states with each other. Amos understood what she needed without having to be told, which was itself one of the gifts of many years lived closely with another person. He was present and patient, and he did not try to make it better than it was, because some things are not better, they are only survived, and the surviving is enough. They buried Clara Hayes in the Clearwater Creek Cemetery next to the Reverend Edmund Hayes, and in the spring of the following year, Matilda planted roses on both graves from cuttings taken off the eastern fence of the Creek Bend property, the same roses her father had tended, and that she had tended, and that Clara Rose would one day tend in her turn. The century turned in the winter of 1900, and Clearwater Creek was different enough from what it had been in 1878 that a person arriving for the first time would have had difficulty imagining the earlier version. Oklahoma Territory was moving toward statehood, which would come in 1907, and the shape of the world was changing in the ways that the shape of the world always changes, accumulating newness while the old things remain underneath like bedrock. The railroad had expanded its lines, and there was electric light in the hotel and telegraph service that had been there for years, and was still, to Amos, a faintly astonishing thing even after decades of its existence. Amos was 48 now, and Matilda was 44, and the ranch was prosperous in a measured way, the way of things that have been grown slowly and well, and the house at the Creek Bend had accumulated layers of the life lived in it, the marks on the doorframe where they had measured the children's heights each birthday, the kitchen table that had been replaced once and then repaired twice, and was still the same table where they ate supper every evening, the porch boards that had been replaced 3 times over the years because the territory winters were hard on things, but the porch itself was the same porch where Amos had sat in the November of 1880 and talked to God about the baby that was arriving, and where he and Matilda sat on summer evenings watching the fireflies over the meadow. On an October evening in 1900, 22 years after the Harvest Dance, they sat on that porch in the dusk with the first chill of autumn in the air and the creek audible in the cottonwoods below, and the sky going the particular color it went at that hour in October, deep blue fading into purple along the western edge, and the stars beginning. Edmund was away, working a cattle drive that he had organized himself, his first as the person in charge rather than one of the people being organized. And Matilda was both proud and quietly watchful in the way of a mother who has accepted that her children's lives are their own to live, but has not stopped noticing everything. Clara Rose was 17 and had gone into town for a school event, which she would return from before full dark because that was the agreement, and the house was quieter than it usually was, which gave the evening a particular quality of space. Matilda had her shawl around her shoulders and Amos had his coffee, which he drank in the evenings now because the doctor in town had suggested that his constitution would prefer it to the cider he had always favored, which was a suggestion he had initially resisted and eventually accepted. He was in his rocking chair and she was in hers, and between them on the porch railing was a lantern that threw its light in a warm circle that just reached both of them. "Do you remember the Harvest Dance?" she said. He looked over at her. "Frequently," he said. She smiled at the stars. "I have always wanted to tell you something about that night," she said. "Tell me," he said. "I knew you were watching," she said. "Earlier than you might think, I knew for most of the evening." He was quiet for a moment. "Did you?" "You were very still," she said, "and everyone else in that room was in motion of some kind, all that wanting and performing, and you were just still." She paused. "I kept expecting you to come over, and you kept not coming, and the later it got, the more I thought you wouldn't." "I almost didn't," he said. "I know," she said. "That's the thing I wanted to tell you. When you finally came over, I could see it on you that you had been deciding, that you hadn't been sure, that you weren't performing anything. You were just yourself, uncertain and willing." She turned and looked at him in the lantern light. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen a man do. Amos Archer, who was not a sentimental man by the standard measure of things, felt the back of his eyes do something that he did not try to stop. He reached across the space between the chairs and she put her hand in his, the same hand he had taken at the Harvest Dance when she said yes, and they sat in the dark with the stars coming out overhead and the creek running in the cottonwoods below, and the lantern burned between them, and the October air was cold and clear, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. The years continued to unroll in the way that years do when they are good ones, not without difficulty and not without change, but with the fundamental rightness of things that have been built on solid ground. Edmund came back from the cattle drive in November, sunburned and competent and already planning the next one, and he sat at the supper table in the Creek Bend kitchen and talked about the drive with the animation of a young man discovering that he is capable of the things he hoped he was capable of. And Amos listened to his son the way he listened to everything, with full attention. And Matilda served the supper and listened too, and saw her father in Edmund's straight back and her husband in Edmund's careful words and herself in Edmund's eyes, and felt the particular joy of a woman who has been part of making something that will continue past her. Clara Rose came back from Philadelphia in 1910, a doctor, a remarkable fact that was still taking the town of Clearwater Creek some time to accommodate, and she set up a small practice in what had been a storage room in the building next to the county school, because it was the only space available, and she had not come this far to be stopped by a lack of appropriate space. She was a good doctor, which was the other remarkable fact, and within a year the storage room was insufficient for the number of people who came to see her, and she moved to a proper office on Main Street, which by then had glass storefronts and electrical wiring, and was nothing like the dusty Main Street that Amos had ridden into in 1874 as a young man from Missouri looking for something he could not yet fully name. He had found it, though. He had found it that October evening at the Harvest Dance in 1878, when he had crossed a room of people and taken his hat off and said the true thing rather than the calculated thing, and she had looked at him and said yes. He was 63 when Oklahoma had been a state for 5 years, and she was 59, and the Creek Bend property had been in full operation for 3 decades, and the cattle herd that had started at 20 head was now a proper operation with its own hands and its own accounting and its own rhythms that ran alongside the seasonal rhythms of the land itself. The house had been added to twice and was now a real house by any measure, with a proper parlor and a kitchen that was large enough for the family gatherings that happened at Thanksgiving and Christmas and Easter, when Edmund and his wife Helen, whom he had married in 1903, came out with their children, and Clara Rose came from her practice in town, and the table was full and loud in the way of a table around which life has accumulated. Edmund and Helen had 3 children, a boy named Henry for Amos's grandfather, and then twin girls named Anna and Frances, who were 7 years old in 1915, and who treated the Creek Bend house as an extension of their natural territory, running the meadow in summer and sitting in their great-great-grandmother's chair in the parlor in winter with the proprietary comfort of children who have been entirely loved. Amos watched his grandchildren from the porch in the evenings and felt something he could not always name exactly, the compounded goodness of decades, the particular harvest of a life lived with intention and honesty, and the specific good fortune of having found, in the autumn of 1878, the person who would make everything possible. Matilda was still teaching, though only 3 days a week now, because Clara Rose had opinions about her mother's energy that she expressed with the professional authority of a doctor and the personal authority of a daughter, which was a combination that even Matilda Hayes found difficult to argue with at length. She had helped train the younger teachers at the county school over the years, passing on not just curriculum but the philosophy behind it, which was that every child in a room is a person in full, entitled to the full attention of the person standing at the front of it. On the evening of their 35th anniversary, June the 21st, 1914, Amos took Matilda on a walk along the creek. The cottonwoods were in full summer leaf, enormous now, much larger than they had been when he had stood on this bank as a young man of 26, imagining what he would build. The sun was low and golden, and the water caught it and threw it up in pieces that moved across the surface with the current. They walked slowly, which was the pace that suited them both now, the pace of people who have no need to hurry toward anything. They stopped at the place where the creek bent and the bank was wide, the same place they had sat together in the October of their courtship, and she had said she saw why he wanted this land. Patient land, she said now, as though they were resuming a conversation that had been paused for 35 years and continued without interruption. Patient land, he agreed. They stood side by side looking at the water. Are you happy? She asked, not because she doubted the answer, but because she believed that happiness deserved to be spoken aloud, to be confirmed in language rather than only assumed. Amos Archer looked at the creek bending through the cottonwoods, at the land they had built on, at the woman beside him who had said yes to him at the harvest dance, and yes to the house, and yes to the children, and yes to the life, always from the same place, the honest and self-knowing place that he had recognized the first time he stood close enough to see it. I am the happiest man I know how to be, he said, which is a great deal more than I thought a man could be when I was young. She put her hand in his, and he closed his fingers around it, and they stood there in the evening light, at the bend in the creek, on the patient land, and the water moved past them, and the cottonwoods stood in their full summer height, and the sky above the territory was enormous and blue, and full of the kind of light that makes everything look exactly as it is. And what it was, in the fullness of all its years and all its work and all its choosing, was good. It was very, very good. The harvest dance had been the first yes, but the life they had built together was a yes they had said to each other every morning and every evening, in the small and the large things, in the work and the rest, in the difficulty and the ease. It was the yes of two people who had understood, from the moment he walked across a barn full of paper lanterns and took his hat off and said the true thing, that they were the kind of rare and fortunate match that makes the world feel purposeful. And when the evening finally came that Amos Archer took his hat off for the last time and lay down in the bed in the Creek Bend house with the window open to the Oklahoma sky and his wife's hand in his and the sound of the creek below in the cottonwoods, he went with the same quiet certainty he had brought to everything, the certainty of a man who has examined his life and found it whole. And Matilda, who would live on another 12 years and teach another decade of children and watch her grandchildren grow into the 20th century, who would sit on the porch in her old age and look at the creek bending through the cottonwoods and feel his absence as a permanent presence, a space in the world shaped exactly like him that she moved around with the practiced care of long knowledge. Matilda kept the yes alive the only way anyone can keep anything alive, by living in it, fully and without reservation for every remaining day. That was what love was, she had learned. Not the moment of saying yes at the harvest dance, though that moment had been everything. Not the wedding, not the first years, not any single peak of feeling. It was the accumulation, the daily choosing, the patience of it, the way water is patient with a bank, moving through it slowly and permanently, leaving its shape in everything it touched. Patient land, patient love. They had built it together, Amos and Matilda Archer, at the Creek Bend in the Oklahoma Territory, in the autumn of their lives that had begun in the autumn of the world they were given, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.